Welcome everybody, my name is Beth Sewell, I'm chair of the Suffolk Poetry Society. I think Colin's probably going to tell you a little bit about us, but it is our 70th birthday year this year, so we're very pleased not to be celebrating Ronnie's 100th birthday along with our 70th, so this is a very special occasion for us. Although technically Ronnie isn't a poet, his work is so poetical, we've claimed him. So I'm going to hand over to Colin to do the real deal, but welcome, thank you for coming and enjoy yourselves this afternoon.
Well, it's amazing to see such a big turnout, so thank you very much for coming and showing your interest in Ronnie. As I say, Ronnie has had a long association with Suffolk Poetry Society. I don't know how long when Ronnie was made honorary member of Suffolk Poetry Society. I've been treasurer since 2013, and it was certainly long before then. Ronnie did judge our annual competition, the Crowd Poetry Competition, in 1965, and perhaps he was made honorary then, I do not know. But in 2013, we started a series of things called Desert Island Poems, which were another of my bright ideas, but Ronnie was our first castaway. And he wanted to be interviewed by Dr Francis Ward, who was Dean of St Edmundsbury. So this is what he said at the time about his association with us.
Your association with the Suffolk Poetry Society goes back for a long time, doesn't it, Ronnie?
Well, it does, and almost years of neglect, I suppose. It began when I was working at the library, and we used to have our meetings at my neighbours at the England Arts House, and quite a lot of people came, including the three poets I was associated with in those days, W. R. Rogers, the Ulster poet, James Turner, and various people who knew them. So I started the Culture Literary Society in my 20s, which lasted a very long time. There were all sorts of wonderful writers, novelists, poets, historians, would come. I didn't pay them a penny, I say. And big crowds used to come to the lecture room to listen to it.
Well, so you have to pay people. Anyway, we know Ronnie was born on the 6th of November 1922, and in the following 10 years, he was joined by Harold, Bernard, Constance, Eileen and Joe. Their parents were Matilda, Elizabeth, née Elkin, and Albert George Blythe, who was always called George. Here's Ronnie talking about his family background.
The parents of the legend.
Well, they were old, when I came to London, came from Bloomsbury, but the Blythes were in Suffolk, I suppose, for hundreds of years, still open named, and they moved across from Waverley to the south, bit by bit over the centuries. They were Suffolk shepherds in the early 19th century, and then small farms, and just ancient country, but rather like Thomas Hardy characters in many ways. We went to Newman's Green near Axon, where they all lived. And the amazingly ancient houses hadn't changed for there's some modern bungalows mixed up with them. But these houses where we used to go as children to our grandmother's house, Richard's cottage, and these other ancient houses were still much as I've seen them. And I wrote about them in this series called Stories About Suffolk.
Well, his mother, Matilda, who said was born in Bloomsbury, she was born out of the Tea Gardens in the Strand in London, and she was educated at London County Council School. In 1910, she won a prize for her academic abilities, and she had sung at her school at the Albert Hall. She saw Anna Pavlova dance. During World War I, Matilda had been in the Voluntary Army Detachment, which was a job she loved. And it's not clear whether she was a nurse. Some of the information I've been given suggests that she wasn't formally a nurse, although Ronnie thought she was, and she was wearing VAD nurse's uniform here. And while she was in VAD, she knitted socks, she sewed for soldiers, of which there's a song, and there's somebody here who could sing it. Shush. And she made tents on industrial sewing machines with a team of children shoving the canvas into the machines. And she was 1 year older than George. Now, Ronnie said that they were farmers, but I think he was talking about the Blythe family name of farmers because it's a little more mixed. George, born in 1898, had left school at the age of 12 and did begin work on a farm alongside his father David. And his father expected him at that age to walk a flock of sheep from Acton to Bury St Edmunds Market to sell them and walk back. And he stepped under hedgerows each way, so obviously it took more than a day. And it's a 15-mile journey. I think Generation Z don't know that all the But George did not like farming, and at the outbreak of war, he joined up to the 5th Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment and was sent to Gallipoli and Ypres, Wipers, as a captain's groom, looking after the horses. So on his return and discharge, he was unable to find a job, so he tried to enlist with the 18th Hussars in Bury St Edmunds, but was later discharged after 3 days as being unfit for military service. In Regulations 392(3). He was only 5'6", perhaps he was too short. So what he did, he moved to Sheffield and was making cutlery at a steel mill. But eventually he did return to Acton to be a brickmaker, where he was making bricks by hand. And then that was when he met Matilda, who had come down to Suffolk on a holiday to accompany a friend who was coming to see her boyfriend, who happened to be George's brother. And they met only once more before they were married, on the 1st of August 1920. Well, here is a picture from 1927 with Harold and Matilda holding Bernard, Dr Louise, who was Matilda's sister, and Ronald, aged 5. That could be a picture of me, actually. Here they are, no date on this one, but here they are, Connie, Harold, Bernard and Ronald. They moved home a few times. They were, as Ron has already said, at Newman's Green in Acton. They then moved to 2 Gallows Hill in Sudbury. Now, I don't know where Gallows Hill is, and neither does Heritage Suffolk, because they think it could be here, in Blackfriars, opposite Jill's kitchen window, where she could look out. And
I can hang myself any day I want.
But Heritage Suffolk also think it might be where that green spot is there, at the beginning of the Waldingfield Road. From a few people I've heard, that seems to be the popular opinion, that that's where they were. But in the late 30s, George took a job as a grave digger in Sudbury Cemetery. Then they moved to 22 Jubilee Road. And George was very pleased to say he had 7,000 people under him. And Matilda and George have been very naughty here and used computer techniques to colour that. Well, Ronnie left school at the age of 14. He'd been to St Gregory's and St Peter's, and eventually began work at Cutmore's bookshop in North Street. This was before it was Cutmore's, it was Cheney's. And this is as it is now. Nothing to say. Right. Here's a picture of the family during World War II with Matilda, Connie, Ken Willis, I don't know who that is, Gerald, Bernard, and Ida. Now, this is an interesting thing I came across. During the war, I mean, we know Ronnie didn't serve for very long, for whatever reason, but during the war, he was working at Colchester Library. And I know that because on the 10th of February 1944, this letter appeared in the Suffolk and Essex Free Press. Museum for Sudbury. Dear Sir, considerable interest must again be widely manifest by the renewal of the proposal for a Sudbury Museum, an idea which unfortunately is still quite barren of any sign of materialisation. Mr. Holton mentioned the fact of a once beautiful and cultural town of which now little remains. Actually, as it is today, Sudbury is still an embodiment of great charm, but the beauty is going fast. And if local interest is not practically awakened, in a very short time it will have descended to almost mediocrity. There must be, in a town of Sudbury's antiquity, great resources for the foundation of a borough museum, which, if housed together in one of the old houses, would form the beginning of bringing back to the town the great interest and indeed inspiration which it must have given those men who designed and raised up the churches. The inhabitants of a famed or lovely place are often unconsciously inclined to accept present credit for past glories. Before Sudbury became progressive in weaving and craftsmanship, and without its churches and houses, it could not have presented a very satisfactory picture to its people. When prosperity came, they spent, besides money, great ingenuity, and offered all their medieval artistry to a town of which they could be proud to be called a townsman. These things have endured through centuries to gladden thousands, but for many years no new interest has been taken in the direction of cultural advancement. Unfortunately, there are a couple of blanks, as you can see in the scan, but it's blank and a swimming something and not an achievement. To folk well housed and keen to settle down after the disturbances of war will come a desire to follow cultural pursuits. An art gallery would bring home to us far more than the genius of Gainsborough, than a statue which costs us nothing. A museum is the visitor's first thought when entering such an ancient place, besides being the means of maintaining local enthusiasm and pride. Could not something in the way of planning be done for this object after the war? Could not, as Mr. Holden suggests, a committee formed of educationists, antiquarians and artists meet and begin to make the Borough of Sudbury Museum an actuality? Yours faithfully, Ronald Blythe, Public Library, Colchester, Essex, February 5th, 1944. He was 21. I couldn't know that at 21. Engagement House over the floating sea. So Ronnie had his own campaign going. Now, 2 years later, he was writing again on a different topic, much more amusing this one. Acton Place. Dear Sir, I, and perhaps many other surprised people, learned last Thursday that Acton Place was the original of Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Maybe not know more facts to support this unusual claim, as in no authoritative source can I find any mention of Dickensian Acton. The Arthur Hayward, one of the most authorities on Dickens and compiler of the Dickens Encyclopedia, tells me that if the author had any place in mind at all, it was a house now dubbed Bleak House to the north of St Albans. While that valuable, but not infallible, vade-mecum for local love, the Victoria County History of Hertfordshire, gives Folly House, St Albans, which is supposed to be the house from which Charles Dickens named his novel, although the description given by Dickens does not correspond to the present building. And again, should anyone care to turn the melancholy mansion in Fizz's ghastly frontispiece in the first edition, they still find that no house could be more unlike Acton Place than the house shown there. Fizz was always faithful to his Dickens, as witness the perfect literal and pictorial synchronisation of Guppy, Twaddle and the immortal Pickwick. Forster, Dickens' great confidant, says in his Life that the book was almost called Jack All Alone, the haunted mill, and the lonely house where the grass grew. Much of it was written in France, and it's quite possible that the ominous house knew no existence beyond that great one in the author's imagination. In closing the case against Acton Place, although it would be good to have it otherwise, may I quote a scrap of conversation from chapter 3 between the Lord Chancellor and Mr. Kenge. "And the bleak house," said his lordship, "is in Hertfordshire, my lord." It all makes one wonder whether the oak which concealed King Charles was a tree. Yours faithfully, Ronald Blythe Public Library, Colchester. Obviously widely read even then. And he was on a roll. In June, we only have these 3 letters. In June, he replied to the letter on the left, which I'll read a little bit of. The letter on the left was actually June 13th, 1946, headed Italian POW. "Dear Sir, might I once again beg space in your paper to congratulate Colonel Hamilton on his excellent letter, Maintaining British Standards," this is not Ronnie by the way, "which appeared in the 16th May edition of your paper. I am delighted to know that he set such a great store by maintaining British standards, but is there not a limit to which this ought to be done? The Italians have practically been given freedom of the country, and they often appear in brown shoes that were definitely not army issue." Moving on a bit here. "The Germans are still Germans, the Italians are still Italians, and who knows that both would not attack us again if they got the chance. Could you please tell me how many cups of tea would have been given us by the Italians and the Germans were we their prisoners of war? By carrying on with the good work of liquidating the empire by giving away India and the Suez, the government are setting the stage for Armageddon and doing the will of God, for in that time his Son will come to reign and abolish the politics and knavish tricks of all political parties. We will not then be compelled, dictated to, or bullied, but will do God's will because we will have his laws written on our hearts. T.A. Gillespie, Alphamstone." I hope there are no relatives here. Ronnie replied like this: "Tea and Armageddon. Dear Sir, we have had it with sugar and with lemon, but now we are offered it in a manner quite unknown in Cranford. Mr. Gillespie, though gaily acquiescent to the distribution of empire, finds himself unable to restrain his wrath when his brothers are given tea. For whether men be German Germans or Italian Italians, they must remain Mr. Gillespie's brothers. Love and brotherhood of all mankind are the elementary fundamentals of true Christianity. To read Mr. Gillespie's recent uncharity, after being regaled by his spiritual protestations and Job-like prognostications, is too much. To end the supreme pettiness of his letter with such clarion concepts of the last days is to brush the fringes of absurdity." Pope, in his essay on man, wrote, "In faith and hope the world will disagree, but all man's concern is charity." May I, without impertinence, suggest that Mr. Gillespie forsakes his revolutionary pyrotechnics for a night and reads the true, simple, changeless ethics of Christian-like love to be found in the Gospels. True humanism, such as that belonging to St. Augustine, Nurse Capel, Shakespeare and Paulo Veronese in his Diaries Before Alexander, will ultimately prove a more amaranthine factor in world happiness than all the trumpet bumblings of such prejudice. Believe it or not, Mr. Gillespie replied. I wouldn't have done this. But you can't read his reply very well. It's scanned on these papers. These are all on the newspaper archive.co.uk, and it doesn't cost much to see them and search them. But some of the scans are not very good, and Mr. Gillespie's reply was sort of only half of it there, so you can't really tell where he was going. But anyway, as Ronnie said earlier, he started the Colchester Literary Society while he was at the library. He also met Christian Nash, or Kulantal, as he sometimes uses her German name. She went to the library looking for Mozart's at Arminio, and after a couple of visits, she'd invited Ronnie to join her and John Nash for tea at their home, Bottom Gardens in Wilmington, which has led her to persuade him to quit the library and become a writer, as he was desperate to do that. He did. He moved to Thorpeness, to a vacant property owned by a friend of theirs, where Ronnie quickly moved into the art scene, meeting Anne Forster, Benjamin Britten, Pete Beers, Imogen Holmes, Irene Curry and others. So here was Benjamin Britten, Pete Beers, Ian Forster, Imogen Holmes, some of the people he met. So Ronnie was writing the first of his two novels, Treasonable Growth. He was also writing essays from Statesman, London Magazine and more. Penguin Books had picked up on him and commissioned him to write about the interwar years, which became The Age of Illusion, which I've been reading, fascinating book. And we'll hear some of it later on. They engaged him as an editor of Penguin Classics, and they also commissioned him to write about changing rural life, which of course became Aikenfield. And by that time, I believe he'd moved to Debbage, and Aikenfield is largely based on the adjacent village of Charlesfield. Ronnie had become very involved in church life. I think it's obvious even from that one of those letters that I read of his. When he was, 25, 26 then, he was very much involved in religious matters. But he became a lay reader. And he eventually moved back to Bottom Shop John Nash after Christine had died. And John Nash died the following year, leaving Bottom to Ronnie. I think that was 1977. So Ronnie's involvement in the church grew stronger, became a lay canon, regularly taking Mappins at Wormingfield and others. And he was also invited to contribute to the Church Times and wrote a column for all the words from Wormingford for about 25 years, and many of the books are collections from those. And they're lovely things to read. So he's written 36 books, including his two novels and a book of poems. He's been rewarded for his contribution to literature with the Benson Medal in 2006, 6 honorary doctorates, and the CBE 2017. These will all be mentioned again, I think.